Okay, so welcome to the third in our series in the Middle Way Network on the 5 principles of the Middle Way. And before I get going on this talk, which is our second talk about skepticism, I just want to say a little bit about the context of these talks. So these are recorded and put on YouTube, but you can join the Zoom meetings if you join the Middle Way Network, which you can do on the Middle Way Society site if you look under events. So that's middlewaysociety.org. You can also see on there are links to a series of retreats that are being held at Tyrrell House, where I'm speaking at the moment in Wales, which relate to the themes in these talks. And you will also see the full program of the discussions. Some of the themes are also followed through in other discussion groups in the society. You can also see a link there to the book that this series of talks relates to. So that's the 5 principles of Middle Way philosophy, which is published by Equinox, and is available from them as well as from the main online booksellers. Okay, so let's get going then. I'm going to be talking today about skepticism for the second time, so I'm working my way through the 5 principles of the Middle Way. So this is an analysis of what's involved in the Middle Way. 5 interdependent principles all rely on each other. So just to briefly remind you of that list, so the skepticism, provisionality, incrementality, agnosticism, and integration. So in the first talk on skepticism, which was last time in this series, my main message was that skepticism is a recognition of uncertainty. It's not a negation of any kind. So there's nothing negative about skepticism. And by skepticism here, I mean the use of skeptical argument as a practice to remind us of uncertainty. So that can just as easily remind us of uncertainty about negative claims just as much as about positive ones. So there is quite a widespread confusion of skepticism with denial. And the popular and philosophical uses of the word skeptic often involve that confusion. But here we're just trying to pull out the use of skeptical argument as a practice, hopefully related to other practices on the Middle Way as a path. Okay, so the skepticism as a practice is always in the context of the other 5 principles. So if you're going to be skeptical in the sense of practicing skepticism, you will also be provisional in the sense that you'll recognize uncertainty, and thus you will need to think in provisional ways and make judgments in provisional ways. That is, judgments that recognize uncertainty. You'll also need to be incremental, because you will see the justification of your beliefs as a matter of degree. It's more or less, rather than having a total justification or none at all. It will also be agnostic, because we'll be trying to navigate even-handedly between different opposing absolute claims, true and false, pro and con. And it will also be increasingly integrated. So hopefully it will relate to quite a wide range of integrative practice we might engage in. And in the process of practicing, for example, in meditation, but there are many other integrative practices, we'll overcome conflict, whether internal or external. And those conflicts are maintained by false certainties. So skepticism, again, interlocks closely with any integrative practice. You need to be able to recognize the uncertainty in the positions you are taking. Okay, so, and it's a point I made at the beginning of this series, obviously everything I'm putting forward here in terms of middle way philosophy and the 5 principles is itself provisional, has already gone through a series of revisions in its sort of 20-odd years of development. But certainly I'm open to more discussions and comments and continuing to revise and refine it. So, so looking at skepticism, as I did in the last talk, I emphasized that skepticism is a practice, and it consists of the use of skeptical arguments to recall uncertainty. Used in this way, well, any practice, of course, has to be practical. So it will be practical because it will help us to recognize conditions beyond our current assumptions. So we can no longer just assume that we have the whole story. There's going to be something beyond that story that we'll need to recognize the possibility of alternatives. Now, what I'm going to focus on in this talk, though, is the embodiment of skepticism. So skepticism is also practical because it's embodied. And this is a point that's quite contrary to a lot of the ways that skepticism is often discussed, particularly by philosophers. So if you ask somebody about skeptical arguments and skeptical questions, quite often they'll think of it, it's a kind of head banging. It's remote, abstract intellectual activity. And obviously it can be, but usually when it's done like that, it's done in a way that interprets it negatively rather than as a balanced practice. And if skepticism is also embodied, I think that's very much the key to its helpful use, its connection with the other principles and other practices. So let me start with the way that skeptical argument itself is embodied. So the first sort of area I'm going to talk about is skeptical argument and embodied limitations. Okay, so skeptical argument basically points out our embodied limitations. And again, this is a point that doesn't seem to be often recognized in the ways that people talk about skeptical argument. So last time I talked about 3 kinds of skeptical argument. Those were empirical, so showing the limitations of the information we get from the senses and from the world. Rational, showing the limitations of our prior assumptions, and linguistic, showing the limitations of the language we use and how it doesn't just represent the world. So there's 3 kinds of skeptical arguments. They're all also recognitions of our embodied limitations. Perhaps that's particularly obvious in the case of the empirical arguments. So as I mentioned last time, the empirical arguments for skepticism point out, for example, that we're situated. Right, so I'm just here. I can only see certain things. I can't see through walls. I can't see the other side of the world, let alone anywhere else in the universe. My senses are limited because I'm situated in a particular place. I don't have a God's eye view, as they call it. Also, the range and frequency of my senses is limited. I can't see in infrared or ultraviolet. I can't hear beyond a certain range, etc. And I can only see to a certain distance, so I'm vague in the distance and so on. And my attention is limited. In fact, a lot of what we could possibly get through the senses is actually ignored. So I mentioned last time the famous gorilla experiment, which was the spotlight on that. So yeah, the empirical arguments for skepticism just point out, well, we got bodies, so that means we can't be certain. It's just about having a body means uncertainty. But the rational arguments also point out embodiment, because they point out that we have prior assumptions. So whatever judgments we make, those are going to be based on prior assumptions of some kind. We can't just start with a blank slate and cancel out all our previous experience, all our culture and the models that gives us, that makes us see things in certain ways. Given that we got prior assumptions, those may be wrong, so we may be wrong. And that's part of having a body as well. And then the linguistic arguments, well, again, if you follow embodied meaning, which is, I think, the only sort of convincing way of understanding meaning, meaning comes from our bodies and via our bodies. Yeah, so it's basically associative, and a lot of the meanings of words for us go back in some way to infancy. We build up a sense of the meanings of the language and other symbols that we use from infancy onwards, using a set of schemas, basic categories and metaphors, which continue to extend and refine our understanding of things and the associations we make between words and experiences, or other symbols, such as visual symbols and experiences. So if our language is limited, well, that's again because we have bodies. And what do bodies do? Well, bodies associate things. Our neural systems are a big sort of association process, really. Every time we have new experiences, new neural links are made, obviously largely in our brains, but also sometimes elsewhere in our bodies. So those links are what make things meaningful to us. And because we depend on those links and the way they've been formed, the direction we've grown in, as it were, again, we don't have a God's eye view, we don't have a blank slate, we don't have a totality. Okay, so skeptical arguments all point out embodied limitations of one kind or another. Now, when we get into absolute claims, what they try to do is to defy that. Yeah, so to assume a God's eye view. And they do that through having some kind of infinite scope. Now, broadly speaking, I mean, I could go into some technical detail of this, but I won't here. But a proposition, a claim, an absolute claim needs to be or can be identified by having infinite scope in at least one area of one kind. Yeah, so it doesn't have to have an infinite scope in every respect. So an absolute claim has infinite scope in it somewhere, which means what it's claiming can't be related fully to experience. So there's always something that escapes experience, which can be turned into whatever you like, really. So if you think about our ability to cope with infinity as embodied creatures, well, that's basically functionally nil. I mean, if you, it's easier to toss out the word infinity, but you know, what's that great line in The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy? You may think it's a long way down the road to the chemist, but that's peanuts to space. So, but that's peanuts to infinity. We can't even imagine infinity. So if we were to try and imagine zooming out into space infinitely, then we would do that for an infinite time, so we'd never get there. So it's very easy to confuse infinity with a number or with something we can easily imagine or conceptualize, but actually it's a conceptual marker for something we can't deal with because it's beyond our experience. If we make sort of claims of infinite scope, like claims about all time or claims about the universe as a whole, then we're basing that on our very, very limited experience, even our pooled experience, even if we include all communication we make as human beings with each other and the whole of science, that experience is still infinitesimal in proportion to infinity. So it's, if you think about it, it's grossly arrogant, really, to make infinite claims. And yet a lot of us, in fact, all of us really do it all the time. It's a, and you know, the humankind's one biggest bad habit. So absolute claims are sort of massive errors of scale, really, in relation to our bodies. Our bodies are one kind of scale. They can cope with certain things. They can do certain things quite well within a certain context. But what we're trying to do when we make a claim of infinite scope is to imagine or claim that we have this absolute position. So skeptical arguments are really helpful, basically, for deflating absolute claims, showing basically that they lack justification. Not that they're wrong. We have to make a clear distinction here. Not saying that the negative opposite of the absolute positive claim is correct, which is what you'd be saying if you said that they were wrong, but that they lack justification. So from our embodied perspective, we cannot adequately justify, we can't even infinitesimally justify these absolute claims. But it's only absolute claims that are in any way threatened by skepticism. If we come to terms with our embodied limitations and try to make our claims provisional, then provisional claims are not threatened by skepticism at all. And again, I think that's another thing that philosophers are often not clear about, or not sufficiently clear about. If you make a provisional claim, well, it may well be wrong, okay, but you can always revise it. So you've made the best justified claim you can for practical purposes, based on the information available to you, but you've also taken into account the possibility of being wrong. So in that case, you can change things. So skepticism in relation to that is not a problem. So when we go on to provisionality, which is the next principle, I'll go into more detail about what it means to be provisional in our claims. But yeah, taking skepticism on board is a starting point for that. Okay, so that's my first major point. The skeptical argument involves recognizing embodied limitations, what it is to have a finite human body. But there's also a more positive side to that, which is that embodiment gives us a kind of contextualization, which is crucial for practice. So whenever we're making a judgment of any kind, embodiment will give us a bigger context for that judgment. It's hard to, at the same time, recognize that you have a body and at least seriously recognize that you have a body and follow it through and hold an absolute view, because the two are inconsistent. Yeah, so the absolute view can't reside in a human body if you've really taken on board that embodiment. So embodiment puts things in a context. It's a context of interoception, that is, being aware of the sensations of your body, for example. So meditation deals in that a lot. I mean, following your breath is an example of a kind of interoception. So you can put things in that context, and that's a bigger context, if you like. It gives you a larger context in which to make judgments. Or it could be a context of our sense experience. of our aesthetic, maybe our deeper and more integrated aesthetic experience. And also our social experience. So our bodies are constantly interacting with other people and other bodies. The variety of kinds of contexts which are all connected with the body, but they'll give us a bigger place in which to put any of our beliefs. So our beliefs are no longer all that there is. We can no longer then absolutize our beliefs and assume that they're the whole story. So mindfulness practice, as I see it, has a particular value because it's basically a recollection of embodiment. Yeah, so it puts you back in touch with a kind of interoceptive flow of experience, so that you can no longer get too hung up on whatever it was you were hung up on very easily. And you can also talk about this neuroscientifically. So as soon as we recall embodiment, then we're connecting to the right hemisphere of the brain. So it's our left hemisphere that holds beliefs which might be absolutized, which might be seen as the whole story if they only stay in the left hemisphere, and that dominates and represses the right. But as soon as we recall embodiment, well, that's going to link in to the right hemisphere with its connections to the senses and the imagination and to other living creatures. So there's always a bigger context through the right hemisphere. It's our gateway to that bigger context. You could also, as a way of symbolizing this, you could think about the story of the Buddha's early life. So before the Buddha recognized the middle way, after he'd been through the two extremes, so he'd left the palace and he'd gone forth into the forest, and then he'd also had problems with, or noticed the limitations of, the teachers and the ascetics. The final thing which really helped him to find the middle way was a recollection of a mindfulness experience. So according to the Pali Canon, he remembered a childhood experience of sitting watching his father in a ploughing contest. I mean, he was officiating at this ploughing contest. But he was sitting under a tree and he got into this very mindful, elevated state. He went into the jhanas. So if you go into the jhanas, absorb meditative states, then you're going to have a lot of embodied awareness. So it's this recollection of how he could get a clearer view of things, a more integrated view of things through the body, that seems to me to make the crucial difference that enables the Buddha to move on from that point to recognize the middle way as a possibility. So yeah, I mean, that embodied awareness also, if you think about all the things that can be done with mindfulness now that are being, the way they're being used to help people with pain or people with depression, for example, all of that comes from embodied awareness. So embodied awareness can help to still reinforcing feedback loops between the reptilian brain with its obsessions and its anxieties, and the left prefrontal cortex with its beliefs, and we can get into this proliferating loop, which may be increased through stress between those two parts of the brain, which are just go round and round. And of course, you can sit down and try and meditate just to experience that, and just end up in a loop. But if you manage to contact some embodied awareness, then you start to give that loop a context, and you're no longer caught up in it. So when we recognize that embodiment, that bigger picture, then we also recognize, well, skepticism, it's got a skeptical element to it. So we may be imagining all kinds of desired things, all kinds of catastrophic things. We may be imagining other people's motives, what they said about this and what they meant, or we may be planning what we're going to do tomorrow or whatever. But all of these things, well, we don't know any of that. Yeah, there's uncertainty in all these things we're getting hung up on. And mindfulness through the body helps us to contextualize that. And embodied awareness can also help to make skeptical argument helpful, because of course skeptical argument can be used in one-sided ways, and sometimes it can also feed people's anxieties further. So there are some instances, I mean, I encountered some actually when I used to teach philosophy, of people who encounter skeptical argument and skepticism at a young age, perhaps when they're perhaps a bit vulnerable. They take it very negatively. They take it as a threat to their what gives them meaning in their world, and then they become very anxious about it, or it can make their condition worse. But that all comes, I think, from taking skepticism out of context. So yeah, we could sort of try and protect ourselves from skepticism. We could try and close ourselves up in a world of certainty, in which the conditions we live in will carry on. We could try and live in a palace, in other words, to go back to the Buddha's life. But that's very likely eventually to crumble in some way. Yeah, if we don't face the challenges of uncertainty, and particularly if we try and defend ourselves against them, then this can often lead to a reinforcing loop of defensiveness, protectiveness, fragility, where we resist any change, and then eventually we flip into some other absolute position. So all of that is most unfortunate, when what we could do instead is face up to uncertainty in a manageable way, in a way that's embedded in practice and connects with practices. Okay, so I don't want to deny that skepticism by itself, as it were, so uncontextualized skepticism outside the context of practice can have a bad effect on people. But that's why we need to be careful about how we handle it. Okay, so that was my second major point. So I've talked about how skeptical argument depends on embodied limitations, and also how embodiment itself gives us a contextualization, which is beneficial to practice, and also includes a skeptical perspective. Now, third major point, I want to talk a bit about confidence, because absolute beliefs can give us a false, limited confidence. But embodiment can be the basis of a more genuine confidence. And one of the problems with the way skepticism is often being interpreted is that it's been interpreted as being having a negative effect on our confidence. That doesn't need to be the case at all. So by confidence, basically, I mean the kind of the ease, the sense of security we have when we make judgments about things and when we act in the world. Yeah. And we develop, in a normal course of development, we develop confidence if we're reasonably psychologically healthy. And we'll do that just because of the habitual development of neural paths and muscles in our body and so on, which all interact in response to our environment and the experiences we have. So we get better at the things we do, and we get more confident as we do so. So think about a child learning to ride a bike, and then a bit later, the child doesn't have to think about riding a bike at all. They're confident in doing it. So it can be a bodily thing, it can be a mental thing. And there's nothing wrong at all with confidence. Again, it's fallible, like provisionality, but that's fine as long as we just face up to that fallibility. So we can enjoy being confident when we're acting in a confident way, in the awareness that it's fallible. So I could say that now, yes, I'm trying to, I would say, I believe I'm giving this talk confidently or fairly confidently. And I'm also aware of the fact that it's fallible. And those two things can go together. I don't have to, in order to be confident, I don't have to believe that I'm absolutely right. Quite the opposite in some ways. So confidence is required, not just to judge and to act, though it's obviously required for that, but also to reconsider, more than anything to reconsider. So if you're going to change your mind, that's another level of demand on your confidence. And that's where limitations in people's confidence most often shows up. So a really confident teacher, for example, will be happy to have students point out his or her mistakes, whereas an underconfident teacher will not. Will try and cover it up in some way. So we don't improve our ability to reconsider by knocking our confidence, by in any way diminishing our confidence. I mean, another way of putting that is to use the term self-esteem, which is widely recognized psychologically. So self-esteem is needed for effectiveness in our lives. So skepticism, far from removing our confidence, can help us to maintain it, I think. It does so through awareness that we can correct ourselves if new evidence turns up, or if we need to correct ourselves, that we can take all that in our stride, that we have a complex enough approach to the world to be able to do that. But of course, the term confidence is used in different ways. So there's a fragile and absolutized version of it, which, for convenience, I will call overconfidence. So if we're overconfident, then I think we probably still do have a bodily sense of security and ease of some kind, but that's recruited to absolutized beliefs. So it's associated with absolutized beliefs, so that we believe that the truth of those beliefs is what gives us confidence. We've so much associated, what we've got anyway, because we've got a body, with the absolute security. And probably particularly because a group is continuing to tell us that. So for example, that belief in God is what gives you meaning in your life, for instance. So overconfidence of that kind, at some point, it involves a failure to adapt to new conditions, and is also likely to result in flipping between opposed absolute beliefs. So when the pressures of new conditions become too great, if you're still in an absolutized mindset, then the easiest thing to do is to stay in that mindset. Sorry, I was just missing a new person. I mean, that fragility, that same fragility, can also be indicated by over hasty change. So you could flip to an opposite belief or you could give way too easily. You could change too easily. So either changing too easily or with too much difficulty. You can be a doormat, as we might say, or give way too easily to others' ideas without really examining them. Or you can beat yourself up, as the saying has it, blame yourself too much. So there's a balance involved in making sort of contextual judgments which are recognize uncertainty sufficiently. So all of that can be compatible with confidence and can be interfered with by overconfidence or by fragile confidence. Okay, so that's the alternative, along with provisionality, alternative to absolute belief, which the uncertainty of skepticism points us towards. Okay, now another area of issue to do with skepticism is the way in which, well, people who feel threatened by skepticism tend to assume that it's opposed to finding one's life meaningful. And this is particularly associated with nihilism, with the idea of nihilism, that it's possible to end up believing nothing. Now, obviously, this is based on the confusion of uncertainty with negative beliefs. But there is a kind of common process by which people sort of go through that confusion, I think, which I call skeptical slippage. So it's an identifiable phenomenon, sort of ways in which, particularly because of the ways, the sort of binary way of understanding the world is so entrenched culturally quite often in the way we talk about things, we have this tendency to constantly confuse uncertainty with negativity. So if you do that, then you might feel that you'll end up with nihilism if you take skepticism seriously. But if you take that view, then that also involves the assumption that there is that if there is no absolute positive, if you can't cling to, for example, the existence of God, then the only alternative is an absolute negative. So you're stuck with nothing, as it were. I mean, there's a famous saying by Dostoevsky, that kind of the Russian novelist, that kind of encapsulates that. So he says, if God did not exist, then everything would be permitted. It throws open the floodgates to lack of values, lack of meaning as well. But this, I mean, I think there are a lot of confusions involved in that. But so the basic one is about confusing uncertainty with negativity. But there's also confusions around meaning involved in that, I think. I mean, generally, if meaning is embodied and it comes to us via the right hemisphere, then meaning isn't a problem, in the sense that we will always, as long as we're having experiences and we're making associations, then we'll have meaning, including things mattering to us. But the problem may be that meaning may not be integrated. So we may experience conflict or lack of emotional connection between different motives that we have. So we may lose motivation, as we may put it, at one time as compared to another. We may set out on a particular path and not be able to continue it. So life may seem meaningless because we've lost our connection with what gave us a motivation. So absolute belief is kind of it's a tempting shortcut, but it's not a long-term solution to a lack of integrated meaning. So we may get motivated in the short term in response to the dominant beliefs of a group. So maybe a religious cult, for example, may urge you to accept this set of beliefs, and then your life will be fully meaningful. It will be reinforced all the time by the others around you, which might work for a while. But eventually, may run into the limitations of that group. You may react against it, your emotions catch up with you, as it were, or just lacking the autonomy to act without it. You may end up having to act in an autonomous way, but not being able to. So it's a delusionary shortcut. So instead, what we need is to cultivate inspiration. So there are ways of integrating our beliefs and integrating our meaning as well. And if we can continue with integrated practice, we're able to keep working on that. And the cultivation of inspiration is what may be needed to help to remind us of integrated practice and to stay with it. So that was the theme of the entire archetypes series, the previous series that I went through. So I'm not going to say any more about that now, but it's something most of you already encountered. So skepticism, if it's used selectively, it can promote a one-sided shortcut solution to finding meaning by attacking the opposite. So it helps to prop up some sort of absolute shortcut, such as a religious, absolute religious group. It may be used in a variety of ways, actually. So selective skepticism is, it's a major feature of absolute ideologies that groups that come together and base themselves on absolute beliefs. They usually also have an enemy. They have something they reject, and they attack what they reject using skepticism. They use the tools of skepticism, but they only use them against the people they disagree with, the beliefs they disagree with. They don't use skepticism to examine their own beliefs. So just to give you a quick example of that, so one-sided attacks on materialism, for example. So materialism is kind of bogey for, could be some Christians and Buddhists, for example, some Jungians even. Now, I'm not saying materialism is an absolutist belief, but it's out of all proportion. It's seen as the problem, rather than there being problems on both sides. And you can then find ways of trying to specifically attack materialism, perhaps using quantum physics seems to be a popular move. Just trying to get a metaphysical solution to your problems rather than practicing and focusing on experience. So it can all turn into a big distraction at best. Okay, so that's why we need even-handedness in our application of skepticism. So it's my final, not quite final major point here. So we need even-handedness rather than selective skepticism. So if we use skepticism even-handedly, then it serves embodied and practical purposes. And there's a long history of selective skepticism being used one-sidedly for absolutizing purposes. I mean, the one common example through perhaps the late medieval period and the Renaissance period was the use of skeptical arguments by Catholic Christian philosophers who'd use it basically to say, oh, well, we don't know anything, so we should just have faith in God, so we should rely on the teachings of the church instead. So the skepticism was only applied to other beliefs, not to the unquestionable beliefs of their society. So you get that in Erasmus and in Montaigne, for example, who won't question certain things, despite in some ways using skepticism helpful in certain areas. And a sort of modern version of that is what's known as naturalized epistemology and or the 18th century philosopher Hume talked about mitigated skepticism. So these are basically saying that there's some things we can't help believing. That's kind of the excuse for rejecting skepticism, or not taking it fully seriously, or not applying it consistently, which goes back to David Hume in the 18th century. And what that involves is a kind of determinism. So the assumption that we can't help it. Nature drives us to believe in certain things. So Hume argued that nature drives us to believe in the things in front of us, for example. And you'll find a lot of analytic philosophers continue to make that kind of argument. That kind of belief is compulsory. But I think that whether we believe something depends on the awareness we bring to it. You can question anything if you really want to, if you bring awareness to the question, if you give it a different context. That doesn't mean that we have to question everything all the time. That would be quite a waste of time in some ways. It would not have a practical benefit. But we may need to question some things that we haven't questioned yet at some point in the future, and that's what skepticism allows for. So it's not inevitable that we should have certain base assumptions which are unquestioned, what's known as metaphysics. So however base the assumption, we are actually capable of questioning it. We can question whether there is time and space, for example, or whether we exist, or all these basic philosophical things are perfectly questionable. It may not be relevant to think about all these things all the time. Just occasionally, it may become relevant or have further implications. Of course, I mean, it is perhaps unavoidable that we are selective to some extent in our use of skepticism. So that's in a way part of what being embodied is, isn't it? That we can't question everything all of the time. That's not practical. But that doesn't mean that we should institutionalize the one-sidedness, or end up with a position that says, oh well, we can be, in fact, in practice, be certain about this, and we'll just question that. So there's a difference between trying to question everything all the time, which is impossible, and just being provisional, which involves openness to uncertainty, which is applied when relevant. And we have to continue to make fallible judgments about what's relevant. That's what being human is about, I think. So the pressures towards selective skepticism come from social expectations, from groups of various kinds with dominant ideologies, whether they're religious or philosophical or political or artistic or whatever. Resisting those pressures is quite a tall order. So that's where the practice of agnosticism comes in. So I'll talk more about that when we get onto agnosticism. Okay, so then one final area, which is about even-handedness. It's an implication of even-handedness, I think, using skepticism even-handedly, not selectively. So one way in which skepticism is often used selectively is to apply it to values, but not to facts. So to treat values as sort of intrinsically questionable or relative, but facts as not. So certain facts are taken to be unquestionably obvious. So if you think about the phrase personal values, for example, people usually feel comfortable about talking about their personal values, but bringing the idea of personal facts, well, some people do have that these days, but it's quite a recent intrusion, actually, since the work of Donald Trump and his ilk seems to be the idea that we could sort of make up the facts as we go along. Yeah? But obviously, neither facts or values are just personal. We don't just make them up randomly. On the other hand, neither are they out there in some absolute sense. They're both things that we need to justify and continue to work on our justification of, and they're both things that depend on the states of mind in which we make judgments about them. And they're interlocked, so you can't separate them very easily. The facts out there and the values are constantly interrelated. The very distinction between facts and values has to be provisional. And where skepticism comes in is really that it applies to both. And we don't know either of them, but there's no sort of special pass for facts. I think they're also questionable, even if there is in practice more consensus about a lot of them. Yeah. So Paris is the capital of France. I don't expect we'll disagree about that. But we might disagree about, some moral issue, probably more likely. But the fact there's different levels of disagreement is not the same point at all as there being unquestionable facts and questionable values. It's more complicated than that. So we can have justified and confident beliefs about either facts or values. And that's why skepticism does not imply moral relativism. So it doesn't mean we make up our values as we go along in some random way. And it doesn't mean that all beliefs about values are equally justified. See, how well justified they are depends on how well we justify them using our experience. So it's a practical question. Also, skepticism doesn't imply factual relativism. So I mean, the idea of my truth, for example, which seems to have become a popular term in some quarters, their truth, his truth, whatever. But if truth is something that's personalized, then what's the point of talking about truth at all? You're effectively talking about your beliefs. We can justify our beliefs about the facts, possibly to a pretty large extent. In some cases, there's a very good justification for believing certain things. For example, I think using scientific evidence, there's a very good justification for believing that climate change is happening. So that gives us a pretty good scientific evidence and scientific theorization based on evidence gives us a very good guide to justification, the starting point where factual issues are concerned. Now, exactly how we judge those things, there's more to say about that. The basis of provisional judgment, if you like. And I will say more about that when I get onto provisionality, which is the next topic. But basically, we need to try and apply the maximum range of experience and evidence that we can, whilst also avoiding absolutizations. Okay, so that's enough for now. I'll just wrap up with a little bit of conclusion. So skepticism basically is a set of arguments used by humans. So the skepticism is about the problems of being human, or the limitations of being human. And the problems with skepticism, the way skepticism has been abused or misunderstood, come from interpreting it with a God's eye view. So thinking of skepticism as making negative statements about the universe. Yeah, all the different aspects of this, of these ways of interpreting skepticism go together, really. They're interdependent. Yeah, so if we avoid negativity in our interpretation of skepticism, if we manage to do it in a practical way, in an embodied way, if we have a positive attitude to confidence and justification, and if we try to avoid being selective in our skepticism, yeah, all of these things go together, I think, to create a helpful practice of skepticism. So putting all this together is central to understanding how the middle way can offer an alternative to absolutization. Okay, I'm going to stop there for now. So, any questions or comments?
Yeah, I have a question. Thank you for the talk. It was really interesting. I'm wondering about, like, I mean, to me it sounds like it's kind of like a very intellectual level that we're like talking about, and I think that maybe sometimes some of the problems that you mentioned with philosophy, for example, when people are exposed to skepticism, comes from doing it on a purely intellectual level, I guess, versus embodied. But like, how would you say, like, what are some of the practices that you could break down for people who are maybe like, oh, this goes, you know, who would maybe check out from a conversation like this? Do you think it has something to do? I mean, for me, it sounds like when you describe, for example, the view of the limitations of the human body versus the vastness of possible knowledge, or the infinity. Is it like the experience of vastness, or like maybe you could say humility? I don't know. That's like the basis for this, or I don't know.
We'll talk about intellectual humility, yes. And I mean, sometimes humility can be turned into a sort of pride, but apart from that, if you know, it's one perhaps helpful way of thinking about it. If you start thinking about what humility involves, in that sense, connecting it with practices, yeah, I don't think we can avoid the intellectual issues, unfortunately, because they're also practical issues. In some ways, it would be a lot easier to just talk about skepticism in a kind of more narrowly practical way, I suppose. But actually, the skeptics of the past who introduced skeptical argument did so for practical purposes quite often. So, or at least if you go back to the use of skepticism in Buddhist argument or in Pyrrhonist argument in ancient Greece, it was there was a recognition there that it was practical, but at the same time they felt they had to engage with the wider issues which we tend to think of as intellectual issues. Yeah.
Yeah, I was thinking more also like maybe there's something that can that are not intellectual in nature but can prepare you for this, like in a way of what I was thinking when you were talking about the infinity versus the limits of your own knowledge, or like the one person's knowledge, or even all of science, is just that you can have these experiences, I guess, like these embodied experiences of just, if you just stand in front of, I don't know, a huge desert, or like these kind of experience, I think help with this, give this feeling, and then when you enter an argument, you might be more prompted.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, having experienced it, I don't think I've really had that experience actually, but specifically of a desert, but I can imagine how a desert could give you that sense of openness. Yeah, there's a bigger context. Yeah. But then maybe just experience of mindfulness. I think that's one reason why I talked about mindfulness as much as I did here, because I think it makes quite a big difference. I've noticed a lot of difference in the way, some philosophers who have had no experience of meditation often approach this in a very, very different way from people who have had some experience of meditation. So I think it often does make a difference to the sort of base assumptions we make. Any other questions or comments?
Yeah. So it interests me when you said about potentially being exposed to skepticism, or skepticism not being healthy for a child beyond under a certain age, because I thought, oh, that was me. Yeah. We talked about, I mentioned before, like last time, how I kind of almost was born as a skeptic from a very, very young age. And so you know, you have to children have that kind of why stage where they're like, why? And then, you know, they get given the answers, you know, pat answers from adults. And I just remember very clearly never being satisfied with pretty much any of the answers that the adults ever gave, and just being like, then no, and this feeling like I had to like investigate everything myself in my own way, and just so yeah, definitely. And I definitely think that led to a lot of anxiety. I mean, I had anxiety from the age of about 7. So because, you know, and it has at times led down the path of nihilism, and I'm glad you mentioned nihilism, because, you know, and I've often wished that I've been a person who has, you know, sometimes who has been able to have firmer beliefs, of say, you know, a place to stand and just feel secure in my beliefs, and be like, oh yes, this is, look at other people and they just seem to go through life and be like, yeah, this is how it is, and everything, and this is how it works, and I'm happy with that, and everything's fine. And I've been jealous of them sometimes. So, you know, but so I think for me it's yeah, I don't know, it is balancing up the kind of, as you're saying, like, what do you question when? Sort of pick your battles, you know, being discerning. I think the maturities come from being discerning about what is worth questioning and why, and in what way, and the benefit of that. Does that make sense? Rather than just like, you know, and being happy that, you know, if things seem to be working, just don't poke the bear too much and just question it. There's no need to question everything. So yeah.
Yeah, and in a way, because everything is questionable, if we accept that, then we don't have to actually question everything. That's what's sometimes hard to grasp. But it's interesting, you're talking about your experience, Anne. So would you say that your experience of practices like meditation, for example, help to put skeptical questions in a better context?
Depends what sort of meditation, because obviously you've got, you know, different sides of meditation. Vipassana meditation, no. In fact, the exact opposite, because obviously Vipassana is about questioning everything, every part of your reality, your perception, your every belief you've ever had, your views of the universe. So that's the whole point. So so that's what attracted me to it. But also, yeah, got to be careful with that. What's that? Is it Bertrand Russell's "Man cannot handle too much reality"? Whatever. Yeah.
Well, if you see the goal of practice in terms of reality, yeah, then that can turn it.
Yeah, but in reality, as in, yeah, I'm using that in the context of, you know, if you question everything, and your beliefs about everything start falling apart, that's very psychologically destabilizing potentially. So you've got to be careful.
But what about sort of grounding effect of meditation? You experienced that?
I think again, being embodied. Although I had an issue with the other way, which I just talked about, which is I went through a stage of actually meditation being a dissociative, actually causing more dissociation from my body, which is very weird. So again, can go either way. It's a tool. I mean, so it depends what happens with it and how you use it. So
yeah. Like everything.
Yeah.
Yeah. Any other thoughts? George?
Yeah, just following on from what Hannah was saying there, in terms of choosing when to apply skepticism. For me, one of the useful ways of applying it is where I notice that I'm in some sort of conflict with myself, and that usually means I've got some sort of anxiety, or you might be feeling a little bit, depressed or under the weather or lacking motivation. And what I've noticed is that when I spot those kind of emotional states, and then if I can see the thought that goes with it, very often I realize that it's an absolute type thought. And the instant I spot that, then it often clears things up an awful lot. And that's not by doing an embodied practice. It's just by well, maybe it is that noticing the emotion might be the embodied aspect of it. But it's also really important to notice how it's linked to, or is coming out of, or there's some connection between the two that's indecipherable. And once I notice that, then that all of a sudden just opens up a little bit of space, which maybe is what Leah was talking about with the desert and things. But I often find that relationship is not. I don't find that very often when I'm doing meditation, but very often just normal life. I'll notice that emotive reaction, and then if I can spot, oh yeah, I'm thinking such and such, then it clears it up so much better for me, so much quicker. But it didn't do that before because I didn't have the perspective to put it into. I just went with the emotive experience and the thought and thought, well, that's just the way it is. It's just crap. It's just depressed or whatever it might be. Now I go, oh, that's me getting caught in an absolute thought, and this is the emotion that's arising with it. Brilliant, I've spotted it. I try and pull myself away from it a little bit so I'm not so connected to it or have some space, and then all of a sudden it just disappears off. And then they're back to some different kind of a meaning after that. So I find that very helpful to notice that relationship. So that's when I would sometimes be applying a skeptical approach in personal experience.
Good, yeah. I mean, that's kind of a good reminder, I think, of the interaction of different kinds of practice as well. That you can do meditation maybe, and that, or maybe something associated like yoga perhaps, and that helps to create a certain sort of space, but that may not be enough to recognize absolutizing processes. But you may also apply integration of belief practices like some sort of critical thinking inquiry, and that might help you to identify these thoughts. But sometimes it's difficult to say, that it's this practice that has led to this recognition. It's just you contextualize, and that contextualization may come from one of a variety of directions. It might be very embodied, directly embodied. It might be through the imagination. It might be through thinking. But either way, it's difficult to say that the other kinds of practices haven't fed into it in some way. Are you thinking more fluidly because you fed your imagination, for example? Are you able to think more flexibly because you've done some meditation? And sometimes it's impossible to be directly clear about that, but certainly my experience overall definitely feels to me as though all those things work together all the time, and that's why we need to think in terms of integrative practice as an interlinked, interdependent bunch of things, ways of progressing.
Yeah, just to come back on that, I'm just thinking back on experience and the times when I've been able to actually notice the absolute aspect in relationship to the emotion in the body is when it's in the moment when I'm actually doing something. So if I'm engaged in an activity and I notice myself acting because of the pressure of a particular type of thought or narrow thought, and feeling the emotive quality that arises at the same time, if in that moment I've got enough, you might say, integrative position, then I can then start to do something. Sometimes when you practice meditation, it can be quite a pleasant experience, but it doesn't have that component to it. It seems to me, from my experience, when they come together, So you have the absolute thought, you have the emotive reaction, and you know you're trying to do something. And it's in the act of doing something, so it could be anything really. For me, yoga is very helpful from that perspective. So I can spot these things quite easily often. But having that kind of activity that you're doing that has a certain structure to it that you're following, and then you can notice when you deviate or when you've been absolute in relation to it. And the emotion often gives you the pointer. And once you can spot what an absolute thought looks like intellectually, then that also can be very helpful. So yeah, that it seems to often come together to get the actual practice of letting it go then. Which is also a really important part of it. When you spot it, being able to let it go and not follow it.
Yeah, I mean, that might also help to clarify, perhaps that point might help to clarify the question of when skeptical argument is relevant. It becomes relevant in the course of a practice, perhaps. In some ways it's very difficult to say exactly what is relevant and what isn't all the time, but some things are obviously more relevant than others. And it becomes more relevant if it enables us to become a bit more aware, and therefore to put this absolutized assumptions in some sort of perspective.
I would say that the my criteria, which is worth applying skepticism and questioning if this belief or this thought appears to be causing suffering, psychological suffering, which is obviously very classically the Buddha's approach. He wasn't. The whole point was he was not really interested in metaphysics. He was interested in relieving human beings from suffering, and it's like a doctor would. And obviously that's Byron Katie's approach as well. She uses a form of skepticism in her questioning. And interesting, when George was talking, it was like you just perfectly described CBT, George. when I work with people with CBT, that is that you have CBT workbooks where it's like, this thought pops in, this absolute belief about my mood or my what's going on pops in my head, and this is how you question it, and this is how you see you're absolutizing your beliefs, and this is how you kind of so it's interesting.
One of the tricky ones, though, I'm finding just now is letting go a sense of meaning which is based on a truth claim, and feeling that the embodied experience is as relevant or as powerful as when you feel you're getting meaning from a particular claim that you think this is the way it should be. So it's learning to value that embodied meaning and to trust it enough to think, well, that's enough, that's sufficient for me to continue on with my life. For me, that's a really interesting area that I'm exploring just now. I
mean, when we make intellectual claims or discuss intellectual claims, I think that is also embodied. That's a part of the issue, sort of recognizing that and not thinking that our thought process, our abstract thought process, is completely separate from the embodied meaning that is still being given to it by, this is a left-right hemisphere thing. Although the left hemisphere seems to be working in its own sort of autonomous way, where it's representing how things are or not, all the time as it's doing so, it's implicitly reliant on the models and metaphors and categories and so on that are being forged through experience, process of experience and association through the right hemisphere. So just recognizing that implicit connection, I think, is valuable. It gives things another context.
Could I ask another? I've got time for another question.
Yeah, sure.
Just going back to your previous talk, when you bring up the two different kinds of no in response to a statement, a truth claim, for instance. And I wonder if you can just talk a little bit more about them, because I was a bit confused. I thought you were talking about one of them being more in line with a sort of sceptical approach, but I couldn't quite work it out for some reason.
Okay.
I can remember that far back.
Yeah. I mean, the two kinds of no is just, well, two different ways of interpreting no, if you like. So if somebody makes a claim of some kind, and you say no, that could be a way of asserting the opposite, or it could just be a failure to affirm what that person has said. So what I was suggesting is more in line with the middle way, is the failure to affirm. Yeah. So if you by failure, by the way, I don't mean that you couldn't affirm it or anything, that you're not capable of affirming it. It's just that you decide not to affirm it. You remain in a zone of uncertainty, and you accept the ambiguities involved, remaining short of total certainty. I mean, you can always have provisional views about it, but particularly if someone makes an absolute claim, like it was fated that we meet like this, say, deterministic claim, then and you say no in response to that, they're very likely to think that you're asserting some sort of metaphysical opposite. It was not fated, or it was random, or it was a result of free will, or whatever. But that would take you through reaction just to the opposite metaphysical beliefs. Yeah, just the failure to affirm the other kind of no is the middle way. It's staying in the zone in between those absolutes, and seeking a more justified position in that ambiguous zone.
I learned that when faced with somebody who's presenting an absolute belief or argument, the best phrase to use is "you might be right about that," because it leaves them to interpret that as you're saying that they are right, but also it leaves you to interpret that you're saying, and you also might be wrong. So I like that one. I use that one quite a lot. Yeah, you might be right about that.
Yeah. Of course,
it makes them a bit annoyed easily, but probably not as annoyed as just going no.
Yeah, of course, the subtlety of that might pass people by, but
yeah, that's kind of the point. So you don't get, if you just want to like not get into an argument with them, because somebody's in that mindset will just interpret that as that you're agreeing with them.
Yeah,
obviously you're not agreeing with them at all, but it's so funny how it works, isn't it?
Yeah, it depends how useful it will be even to go into the degree of challenge which is involved in saying no in the sense of not actually agreeing. Or sometimes it's obviously better to be more ambiguous than that because of the practical situation.
I feel like humor is kind of a good way as well, because I feel like humor is always this kind of being skeptical in a more embodied way, where you're not starting to get into seriously arguing with someone about it.
Yeah.
You're like, no, we need to end on a position or something, but you just relatively sort of in a way that what I think that's sometimes really effective. I notice that I have a tendency to be like, when someone wants to discuss something with me, like get into detail until we come to a point where we both understand what the other person is saying also. But sometimes it's better to just make a joke and then everything is sort of clear. And this took me like a long time to figure out. But I mean, of course, some people will be like not on board with it. So it's a bit socially difficult.
Yeah, I think humor can be an integrative practice. The Liz brief mention of it in the book, The Five Principles. So you're putting people's kind of absolutized categorizations. You're confronting them with some ambiguity somewhere. There's a larger context basically for the the absolutized beliefs they may have. It may just be temporary, it may just be light, but you're still giving it some kind of bigger context. But
yeah, I think
obviously
comedian
skill. Sorry, Hannah.
I think comedians, like stand-up comedians, are very good at doing that with challenging absolutized beliefs through showing the absurdity of them. You know, and almost getting people to a point where they're kind of laughing at their own beliefs. You know, and then suddenly catch themselves over it and realize, oh no, wait a minute. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, we're running out of time, so I'll just go through the focus questions before we finish. So yeah, some questions for practice focus, which you might want to think about for the next session. 4 questions I'm going to read out. As usual, I will also put my notes on the Slack area, so these questions are also at the end of those notes. Okay, so first question. Are there any practices you do that help to develop embodiment, for example, meditation or yoga? And if so, how do you think skeptical questions interact with this practice? So that's something we have already discussed a little bit just now. Second question, do you have a positive view of embodied confidence in yourself and others? That might also raise the question of, do you feel you can distinguish between embodied confidence and disembodied, fragile overconfidence? That's often a tricky thing to distinguish. Third question, are there any particular contexts where you tend to adopt a God's eye view or its opposite? Its opposite would be sort of absolute assumption that you must be wrong. False humility, perhaps. Yeah, so that's just something you might want to reflect on. Because particularly, it's possible to sort of theoretically subscribe to provisionality, but actually, maybe in some particular context, maybe if you go to work or something, or you meet a particular group of friends, and you flip into a completely different mode. And then fourth question, can you apply the recognition of uncertainty even-handedly to both facts and values? Okay, so just to run over those again quickly. So how do skeptical questions interact with any embodied practices you do? Do you have a positive view of embodied confidence? Are there any contexts where you tend to adopt a God's eye view or its opposite? And can you apply uncertainty even-handedly to facts and values? Okay, so those might be helpful reflection questions, or you might find other questions that are more valuable for you, but there's something that could be a starting point for discussion, for example, in groups. Okay, any final points or questions before we finish? Okay, so our next session is, I think, the 6th of May, so it's the first Tuesday in May. And that will be on provisionality. So we'll be starting to a couple of sessions exploring provisionality. Okay, so we'll leave it there for now, and hope to see you again in May. Bye-bye.
Bye.